The story of the United States isn't just about dates, battles, or political documents. It's about people. It's about dreams, conflicts, and the messy, complicated journey of a nation trying to define itself. And here's the thing, it didn't just appear out of nowhere, fully formed. It was born out of revolution, rebellion, and a fierce fight for freedom. In just 2 centuries, it grew from a scrappy group of colonies into one of the most powerful nations in the world. But its story begins long before European settlers arrived. Let's take a step back, way back. Imagine North America before any European had set foot on it. Vast, untouched landscapes stretching from the icy tundras of Alaska to the sun-soaked shores of Florida. Forests so dense and rivers so wide they seemed endless. But it wasn't empty, far from it. This land was home to thriving civilizations with rich histories of their own. The first people to arrive didn't sail in on ships. They crossed a land bridge from Asia into North America thousands of years ago. They spread out across the continent, adapting to every environment imaginable, from the deserts of the Southwest to the woodlands of the Northeast. These early settlers weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were explorers, inventors, and community builders. They developed cultures as diverse as the land itself, with languages, spiritual beliefs, and ways of life that were deeply connected to the world around them. Take the Iroquois Confederacy, for example. This wasn't just a group of tribes, it was a political powerhouse. 6 nations came together to form one of the most sophisticated democratic systems in human history. They had a council of representatives who made decisions by consensus, prioritizing unity and cooperation. And this wasn't just about warfare or trade. It was about creating a society based on shared values and collective leadership. In fact, their system of governance was so advanced that it inspired some of the founding principles of the U.S. Constitution. Imagine that. The roots of American democracy influenced by indigenous wisdom. This is a powerful reminder that democracy isn't just about voting every few years. It's about dialogue, compromise, and community. Think about that the next time you're in a disagreement. The Iroquois didn't just shout each other down. They listened, debated, and found common ground. That's something we could all learn from today. Then came the Europeans. It started in the 15th century when explorers were driven by the pursuit of wealth, new trade routes, and a hunger for power. Christopher Columbus didn't set out to find America, but when he arrived in 1492, everything changed. He opened the floodgates for explorers from Spain, Portugal, France, and England. But they weren't just looking for land, they were looking for power, resources, and a way to enrich their empires. But let's be real, this wasn't some heroic adventure. It was brutal. Along with their ships and flags, Europeans brought diseases like smallpox that decimated native populations who had no immunity. Entire civilizations were wiped out. Some estimates say up to 90% of indigenous people died within decades of European arrival. And this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a turning point that reshaped the continent forever. We often hear about Columbus discovering America, but let's call it what it was, an invasion. His arrival marked the beginning of colonization, a process that involved enslaving, exploiting, and displacing millions of indigenous people. The land wasn't empty, it was taken. And acknowledging that doesn't erase history, it deepens our understanding of it. It's easy to romanticize the past, but we owe it to ourselves to see the full picture. History isn't just a list of achievements. It's a mirror reflecting who we were, who we are, and who we want to become. So the next time you hear someone celebrating Columbus Day, maybe take a moment to reflect on whose story is being told and whose is being left out. As Europeans began to establish permanent colonies, the landscape of North America started to change. Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement. At first, the settlers struggled. They faced harsh winters, starvation, and conflict with native tribes. But then they discovered tobacco. Suddenly, Jamestown went from the brink of failure to a booming colony. Tobacco became a cash crop that fueled the economy, but it came at a high cost. The demand for labor was massive. At first, indentured servants from Europe were brought over, but as demand grew, they turned to enslaved Africans. This wasn't just about economics, it was about power and control. The system of slavery took root, shaping the social and economic fabric of the southern colonies for centuries. Let's pause for a second. It's easy to get lost in the history, but this isn't just about the past. The legacy of slavery is still with us today, from systemic racism to economic inequality. The past isn't dead. It echoes through our present, and understanding that is the first step toward change. As the colonies grew, so did tensions, not just with native tribes being pushed off their lands, but also among European powers fighting for control. The fur trade sparked fierce competition, and native tribes were caught in the middle. Alliances formed, wars broke out, and the balance of power shifted. It was a complex web of politics, economics, and survival. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were restless. They were tired of British taxes on tea, paper, and sugar, taxes they had no say in. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord were acts of defiance. Ordinary people were standing up, risking everything for a chance to govern themselves. The American Revolution wasn't just about soldiers and generals. It was about farmers, merchants, and everyday people who wanted a say in their future. Against all odds, they won. But independence was just the beginning. Creating a new nation meant building a new government, and the first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was a disaster. It left the states too divided and too weak. So in 1787, leaders gathered to create the U.S. Constitution, a bold experiment in democracy. It wasn't perfect. It allowed slavery to continue, but it laid the foundation for a nation built on the idea of a more perfect union. But here's the real lesson. Democracy is messy. It's complicated. It's never finished. The United States was built on bold ideas and painful contradictions, and it's been evolving ever since. From the fight for civil rights to today's debates over immigration and equality, the story of America is still being written by us. History isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we make today. So when you hear debates about democracy, freedom, or justice, remember the long, messy journey that got us here. The story of America is far from over, and we all have a role in writing its next chapter. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a call to action. Because the fight for freedom, equality, and justice is never truly over. The story of the United States isn't just about maps and dates. It's about ambition, conflict, and an unrelenting drive for growth, no matter the cost. One of the most powerful ideas that shaped this nation was manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was more than just a slogan. It was a mindset, a sense of purpose that made westward expansion feel not just justified, but inevitable. But this vision of a land of opportunity wasn't without consequences. Imagine standing on a hill in the early 1800s looking west. Endless plains, rugged mountains, dense forests, all seemingly untouched, wild, and waiting to be claimed. But that's just it. They weren't untouched. Native American tribes had lived, hunted, and built societies on this land for thousands of years. To them, this wasn't a frontier, it was home. When settlers pushed west, they didn't just bring wagons and tools. They brought a new way of thinking, one that didn't leave room for native cultures. This wasn't about coexistence, it was about domination. And it led to some of the darkest chapters in American history, like the Trail of Tears. Picture this. It's 1838. Thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children are forced to leave their ancestral lands in the southeastern U.S., marching over 1,000 miles to what was called Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. It's winter. There's little food, inadequate shelter, and disease is rampant. Over 4,000 people died on that journey. They didn't leave willingly. They were forced out by the Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson, who believed Native Americans were standing in the way of progress. This wasn't just a tragic event. It was a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing, and it wasn't an isolated incident. The Trail of Tears was part of a larger pattern of forced relocations affecting multiple tribes, including the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These are uncomfortable truths, but they're essential to understanding the real cost of manifest destiny. And here's the thing, this isn't just ancient history. The impact of these forced relocations is still felt today. When we talk about poverty, land rights, or cultural loss in Native American communities, we're seeing the ripple effects of decisions made nearly 2 centuries ago. History isn't just about the past, it echoes in our present. But as the United States pushed west, another issue was tearing the nation apart: slavery. The North and South were like 2 different countries. The North was industrializing, with factories, railroads, and growing cities. The South was agricultural, relying heavily on slave labor to power its economy, particularly on large cotton plantations. Think about it. Every shirt, every dress, every sail on a ship made from American cotton was touched by the hands of an enslaved person. Slavery wasn't just a Southern problem. It fueled the entire economy. And as the nation expanded westward, the burning question became, would new states allow slavery or not? This debate over slavery wasn't just political. It was about morality, power, and the future of the nation. Families were divided, communities were torn apart, and tensions reached a breaking point when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. To the Southern states, Lincoln represented the end of their way of life. They saw his opposition to the expansion of slavery as a direct threat to their economy and culture. So they made a choice. They seceded from the Union. That's how the Civil War began. But it wasn't just about preserving the Union. It was about ending the horrific practice of slavery. Over 600,000 soldiers died, more than in any other American conflict. But for enslaved people, the stakes were even higher. It was a fight for freedom. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in the Confederate States free. It didn't end slavery everywhere, but it changed the purpose of the war. It wasn't just about reunifying the country, it was about redefining it. The Union victory in 1865 did just that, followed by the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery once and for all. But ending slavery was just the beginning. Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, was a time of hope and turmoil. Freedmen, as they were called, sought to build new lives with the promise of citizenship and voting rights, protected by the 14th and 15th Amendments. African Americans were elected to public office for the first time, schools were built, and communities began to thrive. But progress wasn't easy. There was fierce resistance, especially in the South. Jim Crow laws were enacted to enforce racial segregation, denying African Americans their newly won rights. And hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to maintain white supremacy. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and the South quickly implemented systems designed to oppress and disenfranchise African Americans. This wasn't just about laws, it was about power. It was about who gets to be seen as fully human and fully American. And those battles for equality didn't end with Reconstruction. They continue today. While the South struggled with its identity, the Industrial Revolution was transforming the North. Factories sprang up, cities grew, and waves of immigrants poured in, seeking a better life. But the wealth wasn't shared equally. For the working class, life was harsh. Long hours, dangerous conditions, and low pay. Yet, even in this struggle, there was hope. Labor unions began to form, demanding fair wages and safer workplaces. Immigrants brought with them new ideas, cultures, and foods, reshaping American society. But they also faced discrimination, with policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigrants from entering the country. The Civil War was brutal. More Americans died in this conflict than in any other war before or since. Picture the devastation. Entire towns turned to rubble, families left mourning. And yet, it was about more than just battlefields and politics. It was a fight over the soul of the nation. Could the U.S. be a place of freedom and equality, or would it continue to be divided by slavery and oppression? Lincoln's assassination just days after the war ended was a gut punch to a country already on its knees. But even in the darkest times, there was hope. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and for the first time, millions of African Americans tasted freedom. But the road ahead was rocky. The nation had to rebuild not just its cities and economy, but also its identity. This was a country that had torn itself apart. Healing would take generations. While the South struggled to rise from the ashes, the West was booming. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, setting off a frenzy. Imagine hearing rumors of gold nuggets lying in rivers, just waiting to be picked up. Thousands packed up their lives and headed west, chasing the dream of instant wealth. Some struck it rich, but most didn't. It's a classic story of risk and reward, a reminder that chasing big dreams means accepting big risks. But the gold rush came at a heavy cost for Native American tribes. The land they'd lived on for generations was overrun by settlers. When tribes resisted, they were forced out. The Trail of Tears wasn't just a sad chapter in history, it was a brutal journey of suffering and loss. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. It's a haunting reminder that progress for some often means pain for others. As settlers pushed further west, conflict was inevitable. In places like the Black Hills, sacred land to the Sioux, the discovery of gold led to battles like the Great Sioux War of 1876. It's easy to see these as just historical events, but imagine how it felt for Native American leaders like Sitting Bull, watching their world crumble. It's a powerful reminder of the cost of ambition and the importance of respecting others' rights and traditions. By the end of the 19th century, America's hunger for power stretched beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was a turning point. In just a few months, the U.S. defeated Spain and took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Suddenly, America wasn't just a continental power, it was a global player. But with power comes responsibility. Governing distant lands meant grappling with questions of justice, democracy, and imperialism. This era of expansion and conflict shaped the U.S. into the country we know today. It's a story of bold dreams and harsh realities, of growth and loss, of courage and conflict. But it's also a story with lessons we can still learn from. It reminds us that ambition can inspire greatness, but it can also blind us to the consequences. It shows us the power of hope and resilience, but also the damage of division and prejudice. When we look back at this history, we're not just learning about the past, we're learning about ourselves, about the power of vision, the price of progress, and the importance of empathy. So the next time you're chasing a dream or facing a conflict, remember these stories. History isn't just about dates and events, it's about people. People who took risks, made mistakes, and kept pushing forward, just like us. By the early 1900s, the United States was no longer just a growing nation. It was emerging as a global power. Under President Theodore Roosevelt, the country adopted a foreign policy known as big stick diplomacy. The idea was simple: speak softly but carry a big stick, meaning negotiate peacefully but maintain a strong military presence. Nowhere was this more evident than in Latin America, particularly with the construction of the Panama Canal. Imagine the world before the canal. Ships had to sail all the way around South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was costly, time-consuming, and dangerous. By carving a path through Panama, the U.S. connected two oceans, transforming global trade and military strategy overnight. But this wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was also a political power move. The U.S. backed Panama's independence from Colombia to get the canal built, setting the tone for future interventions in Latin America. But America's growing influence wasn't just felt in its own backyard. When World War I erupted in Europe, the U.S. tried to stay neutral. Picture the nation in the 1910s, isolated by oceans, focused on domestic growth. But neutrality became impossible when Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare threatened American lives and trade. The sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship carrying American citizens, was a turning point. People were outraged, and the call for action grew louder. In 1917, the U.S. joined the Allies, providing fresh manpower, resources, and hope. American soldiers, known as doughboys, arrived in Europe, their presence boosting morale and tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. The war ended in 1918, and the world was forever changed. But while Europe struggled to rebuild, the U.S. entered a time of rapid change and excitement. The Roaring Twenties. Imagine the 1920s, jazz music filling the air, flapper girls dancing in speakeasies, and the first radio broadcasts bringing news and entertainment into people's homes. It was a decade of cultural revolution, technological progress, and societal upheaval. Women gained the right to vote, cars became a staple of American life, and Hollywood turned movies into a global phenomenon. But behind the glitz and glamour, economic instability was brewing. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Roaring Twenties came to a devastating end. Banks collapsed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. The Great Depression was a harsh reminder of how fragile economic systems can be. It wasn't just about lost jobs. It was about lost hope. Families struggled to put food on the table, and the American dream seemed shattered. Yet through hardship, the country found resilience. Programs like the New Deal helped rebuild the economy, providing jobs and restoring faith in the future. But just as America began to recover, the world was on the brink of another catastrophe. In Europe and Asia, dictators were rising to power, and war was looming. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, sinking battleships, destroying planes, and killing thousands. It was a day of shock, fear, and anger, a day that pulled America into World War II. Suddenly, factories that once made cars were producing tanks and planes. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, who became an icon of strength and independence. On the front lines, American soldiers fought in brutal battles across Europe and the Pacific. The war was devastating, but it also united the nation with a sense of purpose and sacrifice. Then came a moment that changed the world forever. In 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. The war was over, but the world was forever altered. The power of the atomic bomb ushered in a new era, the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't fought with soldiers and tanks, but with ideology, espionage, and nuclear threats. It was capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. The fear of nuclear annihilation was constant, and both superpowers raced to outdo each other in technology, space exploration, and military power. But the Cold War wasn't just about international rivalry. It also exposed deep divisions within the U.S. itself. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s challenged centuries of racial injustice. Brave leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. led peaceful protests, demanding equality and justice. His famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963 called for a future where people would be judged by their character, not their skin color. Yet the fight for civil rights was met with violence and resistance. Protesters faced police brutality, bombings, and assassination, but they refused to back down. It's a powerful reminder that real change requires courage and perseverance. Then came a day that would redefine the nation. September 11, 2001, a sunny morning shattered by horror as terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The images are seared into memory. Smoke billowing from skyscrapers, people fleeing in panic, first responders racing toward danger. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost that day, leaving a scar on the nation's soul. But amid the tragedy, there was unity. Strangers became heroes, communities came together, and the world stood in solidarity. The U.S. responded swiftly with the War on Terror, leading to conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars reshaped American foreign policy and sparked debates about security, freedom, and identity. They raised questions about power and responsibility, questions that are still relevant today. Now, the U.S. stands as one of the world's most powerful nations. Its military is unmatched, and its economy drives global markets. But power comes with challenges, from political polarization and social inequality to environmental crises and international